The claim is always the same. Someone stands up and tells a room full of people that they are not an ordinary human being, that God has spoken to them directly, that they alone have access to a truth that everyone else has missed, that following them is not a choice between options, but a choice between salvation and destruction. And people believe them. Not stupid people, not broken people. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, teachers, former soldiers, university graduates. People with families and careers and every reason to know better. They walk away from their lives, hand over their savings, cut off their children, and place their entire existence in the hands of someone who has declared themselves divine. This has happened not once or twice, but dozens of times across recorded history, on every continent, in every culture, across every decade of the 20th and 21st centuries. What follows is the documented story of 10 people who declared themselves God. What they built, what they did with it, and what happened when it all came apart. Section 1. Jim Jones. James Warren Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in a small town called Crete near Lynn, Indiana. His father was a World War I veteran who struggled with ill health for most of his life. His mother worked to support the family. Jones was largely left to raise himself. As a child, he became obsessed with religion and death. Neighbors recalled him conducting funerals for animals in his backyard. He would gather local children, lock them in a barn, and force them to listen to him preach. A childhood friend named Chuck Wilmore later said Jones was a really weird kid. By the time Jones was a teenager, he had taught himself to preach by studying sermons and practicing alone. He had no formal theological training. He attended Indiana University briefly, then transferred to Butler University in Indianapolis, where he graduated in 1961. In 1955, he opened a small church in Indianapolis called the Wings of Deliverance. It later became known as the People's Temple. What made it stand out from the beginning was not theology, it was racial integration. In 1950s Indiana, Jones ran a mixed-race congregation. Black and white members worshiped together, ate together, and called each other family. That was genuinely rare in a city that was deeply segregated, and it earned him real respect. By 1960, the People's Temple had affiliated with the Disciples of Christ denomination. 4 years later, Jones was formally ordained. He was building something that looked, from the outside, like a serious social justice ministry, but the man building it was already becoming someone else entirely. By the mid-1960s, Jones had begun claiming he could heal the sick and predict the future. He staged fake cancer healings at services. He would appear to pull tumors from the bodies of congregation members. The tumors were chicken livers smuggled in by his inner circle. He had staff members gather personal information about attendees beforehand and then recite it back to them from the pulpit as divine revelation. He told members he could read minds. The congregation believed every word of it. In 1965, Jones moved the People's Temple to Ukiah in Northern California, bringing roughly 100 followers with him. He had decided, based on a magazine article about nuclear fallout zones, that Ukiah was one of the safest places in America in the event of a nuclear war. After 1971, the temple expanded to San Francisco, where it grew rapidly and accumulated significant political influence. Jones was not just a preacher by this point. He was a political operator. He delivered votes. San Francisco politicians courted him openly. Harvey Milk, then a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter in 1978 defending Jones as a man of the highest character. Walter Mondale, then vice president, was documented as having asked Guyanese officials how Jim was doing, indicating a personal interest in Jones's well-being. Jones used these political relationships as a shield. As long as powerful people were vouching for him, investigative pressure stayed low. Inside the temple, the reality was nothing like the public image. Members were regularly humiliated in front of the congregation. They were beaten. They were blackmailed. Jones demanded that members sign blank pieces of paper, which his staff then used to create false confessions to crimes. If anyone threatened to leave, those documents could be used against them. Members were pressured to sign over their homes and bank accounts to the church. They were encouraged to inform on each other and on their own family members. Children were separated from their parents and placed under the authority of temple leadership. Black members were told that if they left, the United States government would round them up and place them in concentration camps. Jones himself began calling himself the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, then Buddha, then Lenin, then Father Divine. The divine claim shifted depending on the audience and the moment, but the function was always the same. If Jones was God, there was no authority above him. No law, no court, no government could overrule him. His decisions were sacred by definition. By 1977, media pressure was building. New West magazine was preparing to publish a detailed account of abuse inside the People's Temple. On the night an editor read Jones the contents of the article over the phone, Jones packed up and left San Francisco. He moved to Jonestown, a remote agricultural settlement in the jungles of Guyana, South America, that his organization had been building since 1974. Several hundred followers came with him immediately. By 1978, the population of Jonestown had climbed to just under 900 people. What Jones had told his followers Jonestown would be, and what it actually was, were two completely different things. He had promised a socialist paradise, a community free from racism, poverty, and American capitalism. What they got was a labor camp. Temple members worked 6 days a week in the fields, from roughly 6:30 in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. The food was deliberately inadequate. Former member Deborah Layton, who escaped 6 months before the massacre and gave a sworn affidavit to U.S. officials, described the diet as rice for breakfast, rice water soup for lunch, and rice and beans for dinner. On Sundays, each person received 1 egg and 1 cookie. 2 or 3 times a week, there were vegetables. Jones himself did not eat the same food. He consumed substantial meals that regularly included meat, claiming his blood sugar required it. Passports were confiscated upon arrival so members could not leave. Letters home were censored. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. At night, Jones would broadcast his voice over loudspeakers for hours, delivering rambling sermons. Members were forced to attend lengthy, late-night meetings. Sleep deprivation was constant. Jones had also begun conducting what he called white nights. In the middle of the night, the camp alarm would sound and all members would be ordered to the central pavilion. Jones would announce that enemies were closing in and that the time had come for revolutionary suicide. Members would be given a liquid to drink. Then Jones would announce it was a test. The liquid had not been poisoned, but the practice conditioned members to obey the command without question. By late 1978, Jones was in severe physical decline. He was addicted to multiple drugs. Survivors recalled that his voice over the loudspeakers became increasingly slurred and incoherent. His sermons grew more paranoid and disjointed. The Jonestown physician was sidelined after a suspicious illness. Jones's inner circle was fracturing. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan of California flew to Guyana. Ryan represented a district with significant People's Temple membership and had received letters from constituents saying their family members were being held in Jonestown against their will. He arrived in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, on November 14th, accompanied by journalists, photographers, and a number of concerned relatives. On November 17th, Ryan's delegation arrived at Jonestown. Jones initially welcomed them. That evening, there was a dinner and entertainment. Jones agreed to meet with journalists. But during the visit, a reporter was passed a handwritten note from People's Temple members asking to be taken out. When Jones learned of the note, his demeanor changed. On the morning of November 18th, Ryan's group and a number of Temple defectors who wanted to leave made their way to a nearby airstrip at Port Kaituma. As they prepared to board planes, a group of gunmen sent by Jones arrived at the airstrip and opened fire. Congressman Ryan was shot and killed. 3 members of the press were killed. 1 Temple defector was killed. 11 others were wounded. Back at Jonestown, Jones called the entire population to the Central Pavilion. A recording exists of what followed. On the tape, Jones can be heard telling the congregation that the time had come, that Ryan's death meant the U.S. government would descend on them, that they had no choice. A large metal vat was brought out. It contained a mixture of cyanide, sedatives, and flavored punch powder. Nurses used syringes to squirt the mixture into the mouths of the youngest members first. Children died before their parents. Adults then lined up to drink. Those who hesitated were held down and injected. Armed guards ringed the pavilion. Jones was found dead at the scene with a gunshot wound to the head. Whether he shot himself or was shot by someone else was never definitively determined. Guyanese authorities arrived the next day to find 909 people dead in Jonestown. An additional 4 people had died at the airstrip. The total death count reached 913. Among the dead were 304 children. At the time, it was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a non-natural event in U.S. history. That record stood until September 11, 2001. A small number of people survived. Some hid in the jungle as the deaths were happening. Some were in Georgetown or other parts of Guyana that day. Stanley Clayton and Odell Rhodes managed to slip past the guards. A group of 11 members had walked 35 miles that morning under the pretense of going on a picnic. An elderly woman named Hyacinth Thrash slept through the entire event inside her cabin and woke to find everyone around her dead. Larry Layton, a Temple member who participated in the attack at the airstrip, was the only People's Temple member tried and convicted in the United States. He received a life sentence and was released on parole in 2020 after serving 38 years. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the English language as a result of Jonestown, though the drink used was actually Flavor Aid. The casual use of the phrase in everyday conversation strips out the reality of what actually happened. That hundreds of children were killed first, that many adults were injected against their will, and that the man who ordered it had spent years methodically dismantling every psychological defense his followers possessed until compliance felt like the only possible response. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case follows a man who also claimed to speak directly for God. But instead of building his kingdom in a jungle, he built it on 77 acres of Texas farmland, surrounded it with firearms, and waited for the government to come to him. What happened next played out on live television for 51 days. Section 2. David Koresh. Vernon Wayne Howell was born on August 17, 1959, in Houston, Texas. His mother was 14 years old when he was born. His father was 20 and not in the picture. 2 years later, his mother moved to Dallas, leaving him to be raised by his maternal grandmother. He was dyslexic, struggled badly in school, and was held back several grades. Other kids called him Mr. Retardo. He had almost no friends. The one thing that held his attention was the Bible. He memorized large portions of it as a teenager, not because anyone told him to, but because he found in it something that made sense when almost nothing else did. By his mid-teens, he had developed an extraordinary recall of Scripture and could cross-reference passages from different books in real time, building arguments dense enough to impress people with far more formal education than he had. In 1979, Howell joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Tyler, Texas. He was already convinced he had a special ability to interpret the Bible that no one else possessed. The local congregation grew tired of him quickly. He argued constantly with the pastor and began drawing younger members away from official teaching. The church expelled him in 1981. That same year, he drove to Waco and walked into the Mount Carmel Center, the compound belonging to a small splinter group called the Branch Davidians, a community of fewer than 200 people who believed they were waiting for the imminent return of Jesus. The group was being led by a woman named Lois Roden, who was in her late 60s. Howell began a sexual relationship with her. He was 21, she was 67. Through that relationship, he gained access to the community's inner circle and began teaching Bible studies. Members who had been studying Scripture their entire lives found themselves unable to counter his arguments. He had a specific focus on the 7 seals described in the book of Revelation and claimed he alone could open them. Lois Roden died in 1986. Her son, George Roden, believed he was the rightful successor. Howell believed he was. The two clashed openly, and in 1985, Howell was expelled from Mount Carmel along with his followers. In 1987, he returned with 7 armed followers and raided the compound. He and George Roden exchanged gunfire. Howell was charged with attempted murder. The case ended in a mistrial. While awaiting his second trial, George Roden killed another Branch Davidian member with an axe and was committed to a psychiatric institution. The charges against Howell were dropped. By 1990, Howell was the undisputed leader of the Branch Davidians. He legally changed his name to David Koresh, David from the biblical king, Koresh from the Hebrew name for Cyrus, the Persian king who freed the Jewish people from captivity. The name change was not cosmetic. It was a theological statement about who he believed he was. Koresh began teaching what he called the New Light doctrine. At its center was the claim that he had been chosen by God to father a new lineage of children who would rule in the coming kingdom. In practical terms, this meant all the women at Mount Carmel were his spiritual wives, regardless of whether they were already married, regardless of their age. Under the leader's doctrine, existing marriages were set aside, and underage individuals were brought into these arrangements. Official records indicated some individuals were very young. The leader fathered many children with multiple women in the group. Other members accepted this due to a long-established belief system that framed opposition as defiance of divine authority, with significant personal and psychological barriers to leaving. The leader also accumulated weapons. The community had always possessed firearms as part of its rural setting, but the scale increased significantly. The group operated a licensed firearms business, attended gun shows, and legally acquired large quantities of rifles, conversion kits that could make semi-automatic weapons fire automatically, and quantities of ammunition and inert grenades that could be converted into live ones. ATF investigators later documented 136 firearms inside the compound, along with materials to significantly expand that arsenal. Koresh told his followers the weapons were necessary for the end times, that the apocalypse was coming and they would need to defend themselves against the forces of Babylon, his term for the United States government. In June 1992, a postal worker told a local sheriff he believed he had been delivering explosive components to the compound. The sheriff passed the information to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Over the following months, investigators documented the weapons purchases, sent in an undercover agent named Robert Rodriguez, and built a case that Koresh and the Branch Davidians were in illegal possession of machine guns and destructive devices. By early 1993, the Waco Tribune-Herald was preparing to publish a 7-part investigative series on Koresh. The ATF felt that once it published, Koresh would become far more difficult to arrest safely. They planned a large-scale raid for February 28, 1993, intending to arrest Koresh and execute a search warrant simultaneously. The operation was compromised before it began. A local television reporter tipped off about the raid stopped to ask for directions from a postal worker who turned out to be Koresh's brother-in-law. The brother-in-law went to Mount Carmel and told Koresh a raid was coming. Robert Rodriguez, the undercover agent, was inside the compound that morning. When Koresh confronted him, Rodriguez made an excuse and left, immediately informing ATF supervisors that the element of surprise was gone. The supervisors decided to proceed anyway. More than 70 ATF agents arrived at Mount Carmel in cattle trailers on the morning of February 28th. What happened in the next moments is disputed to this day. The ATF says the Branch Davidians fired first. Surviving Branch Davidians say the ATF fired first. What is not disputed is the result. A 2.5-hour gun battle erupted. 4 ATF agents were killed. 20 more were wounded. 6 Branch Davidians died. Koresh himself was shot in the wrist and the left side. A ceasefire was negotiated by phone. Koresh agreed to stop shooting in exchange for his sermons being broadcast on local radio. The ATF withdrew. The FBI's hostage rescue team took command. Within days, nearly 900 law enforcement personnel had surrounded the compound. Tanks and armored vehicles took up positions on the perimeter. The 51-day siege had begun. During the standoff, Koresh released 21 children and some adults in exchange for supplies. FBI negotiators had 117 separate telephone conversations with Koresh, totaling approximately 60 hours. He engaged extensively in long theological arguments about the 7 seals and promised repeatedly to surrender once he had finished writing a document explaining his interpretation. The FBI grew increasingly skeptical any surrender was coming. They cut the electricity to the compound, shone floodlights on it at night, and played recordings of Tibetan chanting, jet aircraft sounds, and the sounds of rabbits being slaughtered over loudspeakers. None of it produced a surrender. By April, Attorney General Janet Reno approved a plan to inject CS gas into the compound using specially equipped tanks. She later said that if she had known how it would end, she never would have done so. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning on April 19, 1993, 2 FBI tanks moved toward the compound and began punching holes in the walls, inserting gas canisters. The Branch Davidians responded by firing on the tanks. For more than 5 hours, tanks made repeated insertions of gas into the building, depositing around 400 canisters in total. At approximately noon, fire broke out, not in one place, but in several simultaneously. Aerial footage showed at least 3 separate ignition points. Audio surveillance recordings captured Branch Davidian members discussing pouring fuel on hay as the fires started. The FBI maintained their agents fired no live rounds that day. Critics disputed this, and the debate over the exact sequence of events has continued for decades. The fire spread rapidly through a compound built largely of wood. Firefighters were unable to enter immediately due to ongoing gunfire from inside. The building was engulfed and destroyed within minutes. 9 people escaped and were arrested. Everyone else inside died. The final count was 76 Branch Davidians killed, including 28 children. Among the dead were people who had been shot, evidence that some members were killed by fellow Branch Davidians rather than dying in the fire. Koresh was found dead with a single gunshot wound to the center of his forehead. Whether he shot himself or was shot by someone else was never conclusively determined. Koresh was 33 years old. He had told his followers he was the Lamb of God. He died in a burning building on a rural Texas property, surrounded by the bodies of the people he had led there. In the aftermath, the siege became one of the most analyzed law enforcement events in American history. Congressional hearings were held. Independent investigations were conducted. Combined with the Ruby Ridge standoff the previous year, Waco became the primary stated justification cited by Timothy McVeigh when he carried out the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995, exactly 2 years after the fire at Mount Carmel. 168 people died in that bombing. The Mount Carmel site was eventually cleared. A small surviving community of Branch Davidians built a new chapel there. It still stands. Some of Koresh's former followers, even decades later, maintained their belief in his teachings. What the Branch Davidians left behind was not just a body count. It was a documented blueprint for how a man with no credentials, no formal education, and no institutional backing could take complete control of hundreds of people's lives using only his ability to argue scripture. Koresh never needed an army. He needed people who believed that questioning him meant questioning God. The next case involves a man who made the same theological claim but took it somewhere entirely different. Instead of waiting for the apocalypse inside a compound, he decided the way to escape the end of the world was to ride a comet, and he convinced 38 people to die with him in the attempt. Section 3. Marshall Applewhite. Marshall Herff Applewhite Jr. was born on May 17, 1931, in Spur, Texas. His father was a Presbyterian minister. Growing up in a household built around religious devotion and the authority of a man who spoke on behalf of God was the foundational experience of his life. Applewhite was academically capable and musically gifted. He attended Austin College in Sherman, Texas, studied music and philosophy, and later pursued a graduate degree in music at the University of Alabama. By his late 20s, he had carved out a legitimate career in music education, teaching at the University of Alabama and later directing the music program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where colleagues regarded him as talented and charismatic. His personal life was considerably more complicated. Applewhite was gay at a time and in a region where that was not something anyone discussed openly. He was married for a period and had children. He struggled intensely with his sexuality throughout his adult life, seeing it as something to be overcome rather than accepted. That internal conflict shaped how he eventually constructed his theology, which placed extreme importance on transcending the physical body and all its desires. In 1970, Applewhite resigned from the University of St. Thomas following what were described as emotional difficulties. His father had recently died, sending him into severe depression. He later said that during this period, he began hearing voices and experiencing apocalyptic visions. In early 1972, Applewhite met Bonnie Lou Nettles at a hospital in Houston. Nettles was 44 years old, a married registered nurse with 4 children who had developed a serious interest in theosophy, astrology, and channeling spirits. By Applewhite's own account, the connection was immediate and unlike anything he had experienced before. Within months, the two were inseparable. Together, they became convinced they were the 2 witnesses described in the 11th chapter of the Book of Revelation, divine beings sent to earth to prepare humanity for what was coming. Nettles left her husband. Applewhite walked away from his career. The two began traveling across the United States, calling themselves Bo and Peep, then Him and Her, then Do and T. In 1974, Applewhite was arrested in Missouri on a charge of credit card fraud, for failing to return a rental car. He served several months in jail. Nettles waited for him. The theology they were building fused Christian eschatology with science fiction concepts about extraterrestrial life. They taught that Jesus had not been human in the traditional sense. He was an alien from a higher level of existence who had taken a human body as a container. His resurrection was not a miracle. It was a physical transformation from a human body into an extraterrestrial one. That same process, they said, was available to anyone willing to follow the path they were laying out. They called the destination the next level. Not a metaphorical heaven, but a literal physical place inhabited by beings who had evolved beyond human existence. Getting there required two things: completely rejecting everything human, money, family, sexuality, personal identity, and following T and Doe, because they were the only ones who knew the way. In September 1975, Applewhite and Nettles held a meeting in the small Oregon town of Waldport. More than 200 people showed up. Dozens walked away from their lives that same night, jobs abandoned, families left behind. By the mid-1970s, the group had several hundred members traveling together, living communally, and waiting for the spaceship they had been promised. The spaceship did not come. This is the critical moment in Heaven's Gate's history that is easy to skip past, but essential to understand. When the UFO failed to appear as promised, people left. The group shrank from several hundred members in the mid-1970s to around 80 by 1980. By the time of the mass suicide in 1997, there were only 39 people left. A failed prophecy is ordinarily the end of a religious movement. For Heaven's Gate, it was a theological revision. Physical ascension was no longer the path. The human body was just a container, a vehicle, and the vehicle would eventually have to be left behind. The soul was what mattered, and the soul could reach the next level, but only if the person was willing to exit the human body entirely. The group adopted an increasingly monastic structure. Members were expected to be celibate. They wore identical loose-fitting clothing designed to downplay individual identity and gender. They cut their hair short, ate communally, and followed a strict daily schedule. In 1985, Bonnie Nettles died of cancer. She was 58. Her death was a profound theological crisis. They had both taught that their bodies would be transformed, not that they would die of illness like ordinary people. Applewhite processed the loss by reframing it. Nettles had not failed. She had simply gone ahead, graduated to the next level first, and was waiting there for the rest of them. Her death became evidence of the process rather than evidence against it. After Nettles died, Applewhite became the sole leader. The group moved frequently, living communally across the American West and Southwest. In 1993, they placed a full-page advertisement in USA Today announcing their presence. The response was minimal. They began posting their teachings on early internet forums and later their own website called Heaven's Gate. The response online was overwhelmingly negative. People mocked them. Applewhite found the rejection painful. It pushed the group further inward. 8 men in the group, including Applewhite himself, voluntarily underwent castration. For Applewhite, who had struggled with his sexuality his entire adult life, the act appears to have been personally significant beyond its theological framing. The group supported themselves financially by running a website design business called Higher Source. They were good at it, building websites for clients, including a local astronomical society, a detail that carries particular weight given what came next. In late 1995, an amateur astronomer named Chuck Schrammick photographed the comet Hale-Bopp and noticed what he thought was a large object trailing behind it. He described what he had seen on a late-night radio program, suggesting there might be a companion object following the comet. Professional astronomers quickly determined there was no such object. The image was a misidentified star. But the story had already traveled across the internet. Heaven's Gate was one of the communities primed to believe it. Applewhite became convinced the companion object was real, that it was a spacecraft, and that its arrival alongside Hale-Bopp was the signal the group had been waiting for. The comet would reach its closest approach to Earth in late March 1997. That, Applewhite decided, was when the spacecraft would be there to collect them. The group had always said suicide was wrong, but what they were planning was not suicide. In their framework, it was graduation. They were not killing themselves. They were stepping out of their containers so their souls could board the ship. In October 1996, Applewhite rented a large house at 18,241 Colina Norte in the San Diego County suburb of Rancho Santa Fe. He told the owner his group consisted of Christian-based angels. He paid the rent reliably. The neighbors had no idea what was being planned inside. During March 19th and 20th, 1997, Applewhite recorded a video called Dew's Final Exit, speaking calmly about what was coming. He said, "We do, in all honesty, hate this world." He framed the group's deaths as an act of freedom rather than desperation. The entire group also recorded individual farewell messages. They spoke warmly about Applewhite and about how grateful they were for what they had learned. They did not appear distressed. The suicides took place in 3 separate groups over approximately 3 days, between March 22nd and March 26, 1997. Each group prepared phenobarbital mixed into pudding or applesauce, washed it down with vodka, and then lay down with a plastic bag placed over their heads to ensure death by suffocation if the drugs and alcohol were not sufficient. The members who had already died were found lying in their bunk beds, covered neatly with purple triangular shrouds. Every person was dressed identically in black pants, black shirts, and black Nike Decades sneakers. Each had a packed bag beside them, as if going on a trip. In each bag was a $5 bill and several rolls of quarters. On March 26, 1997, a surviving former member named Rio D'Angelo, who had left the group months earlier but had been asked by Applewhite to remain behind and tell their story, drove to the house and called the police. San Diego County Sheriff's deputies arrived and found all 39 members dead. The group consisted of 21 women and 18 men, ranging in age from 26 to 72. Applewhite was 65. He was among the dead. It was and remains the largest mass suicide ever to occur on American soil. In the days that followed, the world discovered that Heaven's Gate was not made up of the kind of people the headlines implied. These were not uneducated or obviously unstable individuals. The group included former students, former professionals, people who had functioned normally in society before finding the group. Several had been with Applewhite and Nettles since the 1970s. They had given more than 2 decades of their lives to a belief system, and in the end, they died for it, without apparent hesitation. The Heaven's Gate website remained online after the deaths, maintained by 2 surviving members who had left the group before the suicides. It is still accessible today. The final message posted before the deaths reads, "Hale-Bopp brings closure to Heaven's Gate. Our 22 years of classroom here on planet Earth is finally coming to conclusion. Graduation from the human evolutionary level. We are happily prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew." No spacecraft was ever detected near Comet Hale-Bopp. The comet completed its pass and moved on. The object Chuck Schrammick had photographed was a star called SAO 141894. It was several thousand light-years away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the same decade, but moves to the other side of the planet, to a man who declared himself Christ in Japan, built a following of engineers and scientists rather than spiritual seekers, and decided that if the apocalypse was coming, he might as well help it along. He did not wait for a comet. He manufactured sarin nerve agent and released it in one of the busiest subway systems on Earth. Section 4. Shoko Asahara. Chizuo Matsumoto was born on March 2, 1955, in Kumamoto Prefecture on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. He was the fourth son in a large, poor family. His father made tatami mats for a living. From birth, Matsumoto had infantile glaucoma. It left him completely blind in his left eye and with only partial vision in his right. At the age of 6, he was sent to a residential school for the blind in Kumamoto, where the Japanese government covered his costs. At a school for the blind, a child with partial vision has a significant advantage over classmates who have none. Matsumoto exploited this. Former schoolmates later described him as manipulative and domineering, someone who used his relative visual ability to position himself above others and extract things from them. He was remembered not with affection, but with wariness. He graduated in 1975 and applied to study medicine at Tokyo University, one of the most prestigious institutions in Japan. He failed the entrance exam. It was a rejection that people who later studied his psychology pointed to repeatedly. He had wanted entry into the highest levels of Japanese society. The door was closed. He studied acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine instead. And in 1977, he opened a small acupuncture clinic in Chiba Prefecture near Tokyo. In 1982, he was arrested and fined for selling fake traditional remedies. He had been marketing orange peel soaked in alcohol as a miracle cure for arthritis, charging customers 200,000 yen per batch, which, at the time, was roughly equivalent to several hundred US. He was convicted and paid the fine. The business was shut down. This is the full resume of the man who would, within 7 years, declare himself Jesus Christ, accumulate tens of thousands of followers worldwide, and direct the production of enough nerve agent to kill millions of people. Around 1984, Matsumoto became seriously interested in yoga and meditation. He traveled to India, where he later claimed to have achieved full enlightenment in the Himalayas and to have met the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama later said he remembered meeting a strange Japanese man but had no significant relationship with him and distanced himself entirely from Matsumoto once his crimes became known. Matsumoto returned to Japan in 1984 and founded a small yoga class in a one-bedroom apartment in Tokyo's Shibuya ward. He called it Aum Shinsen no Kai, which translated roughly as the Aum Immortal Mountain Wizard Association. He changed his own name to Shoko Asahara. The name Asahara means hemp field. The name Shoko means luminous truth. He began producing pamphlets claiming he had achieved a state of enlightenment not reached by any human being since the Buddha himself. The yoga classes grew. Asahara was effective in front of a group. He was physically distinctive, with long hair and a beard that he cultivated to resemble traditional depictions of Jesus. He spoke with conviction about spiritual power and the coming end of the world. He told potential followers that by practicing Aum's methods of meditation, they could develop supernatural abilities, including levitation. He produced photographs that purported to show him floating cross-legged in the air. These were almost certainly achieved by photographing him mid-jump, but they circulated widely and impressed people who wanted to believe them. By 1987, the group had expanded enough that Asahara renamed it Aum Shinrikyo, meaning Supreme Truth. He established a new headquarters at Kamikuishi Kimura on the slopes of Mount Fuji. The theology was becoming more elaborate and considerably darker. Asahara was blending Hindu cosmology, Tibetan Buddhist concepts, and Christian apocalypticism into a framework that placed his group at the center of the end of history. In 1989, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government formally recognized Aum Shinrikyo as a legally registered religious organization. This gave the group significant legal protections and tax benefits. By this point, Asahara was claiming he had over 10,000 members in Japan and several thousand more worldwide. Independent estimates placed the figure lower, but the organization was clearly substantial. It had opened centers across Japan and in several other countries, including the United States, Germany, Sri Lanka, and Russia, where it gained a particularly large following in the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union. What made Aum Shinrikyo different from most cults, and what made it genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond the psychological harm most such organizations produce, was its membership. Asahara had attracted a significant number of highly educated scientists and engineers, graduates of Japan's best universities, people with advanced degrees in chemistry, biology, physics, and medicine joined the organization and placed their professional skills entirely at its disposal. This was not accidental. Asahara actively targeted university campuses. The pitch he made to young, educated Japanese people was specifically designed to appeal to those who felt that mainstream society was spiritually empty and that their technical abilities deserved a larger purpose. By 1989, that larger purpose was becoming clear to those inside the organization's inner circle. Asahara had begun teaching that a third world war was inevitable and imminent. He had identified the United States as the beast of the Book of Revelation. He predicted the U.S. would attack Japan with nuclear weapons. Out of this catastrophe, only Aum's members would survive, provided they had advanced far enough in their spiritual training. The apocalypse was not something to be prevented. It was something to be survived, and eventually, something to be helped along. In October 1989, a lawyer named Shuji Sakamoto, his wife Satoko, and their 14-month-old son Tatsuhiko were murdered in their apartment in Yokohama. Sakamoto had been working with families of Aum members who wanted to leave the organization. He had been preparing a legal challenge to the group. He, his wife, and their infant son were strangled by Aum members. Their bodies were buried in separate locations in rural Japan. The murders were not solved until 1995. Also in 1989, Asahara made a decision that illustrated exactly how he saw the relationship between spiritual authority and political power. He fielded a slate of 25 candidates for the Japanese parliament, the Diet, with himself at the head of the list. He believed his spiritual standing would translate into electoral success. It did not. Every single Aum candidate lost, badly. Asahara received roughly 1,800 votes. The public humiliation was significant. He had tested whether Japan would accept him through legitimate channels and received a clear answer. After the election defeat, the group turned sharply inward. Asahara's theology became more explicitly violent. He began teaching a concept drawn from Tibetan Buddhism called Poa, which referred to the transference of consciousness at the moment of death. Asahara reinterpreted it to mean that killing someone who was accumulating bad karma was actually doing them a spiritual favor. It removed them from a path that would only worsen their situation across future lifetimes. Murder, in this framework, became an act of compassion when directed by someone with Asahara's level of spiritual authority. This was the theological permission structure for what followed. At the end of 1993, Aum's chief chemist, a graduate named Masami Tsuchiya, began synthesizing sarin at a facility the group operated. Sarin is an organophosphate nerve agent originally developed in Germany in 1938. It works by blocking the enzyme that turns off nerve signals in the body, causing muscles to contract continuously and uncontrollably. A tiny quantity, measured in milligrams, is sufficient to kill an adult human being. Tsuchiya's team produced it in significant quantities. They also synthesized VX, another nerve agent, which they used in targeted assassinations of individuals Asahara had identified as enemies. In June 1994, Aum carried out its first large-scale attack. The target was the city of Matsumoto in Nagano Prefecture. 3 judges were scheduled to rule on a land dispute involving the group. Asahara wanted the ruling stopped. Aum members drove a refrigerated truck through a residential neighborhood and released sarin from it in the middle of the night while people were sleeping. 8 people died. More than 500 were taken to hospital. The judges survived. The Matsumoto attack was not immediately attributed to Aum Shinrikyo. Investigators initially focused on a local resident. It was only later that the evidence pointed clearly to the group. The failure to immediately identify Aum as the perpetrators gave the organization time to continue its preparations for something considerably larger. In early 1995, police were building a case against Aum and planned to conduct simultaneous raids on the group's facilities across Japan. There is substantial evidence that Asahara was informed about the planned raids by a source inside the investigation. Prosecutors later argued that the Tokyo subway attack was ordered specifically to create chaos that would disrupt or delay the police operation. On the morning of March 20, 1995, 5 Aum members boarded trains on 5 different lines of the Tokyo subway system during the morning rush hour. Each carried bags containing liquid sarin sealed inside plastic pouches. At coordinated times, they placed the bags on the floor of the train carriages and pierced them with the sharpened tips of umbrellas, then left the trains. The sarin began evaporating into the air of the carriages. Passengers noticed an odd smell. Within minutes, people were collapsing. Eyes were burning. Vision was failing. People were vomiting, convulsing, losing control of their bodies. Emergency services were overwhelmed within the hour. 13 people died. More than 50 suffered permanent injuries, including severe vision impairment. Approximately 1,000 people were seriously injured. Around 5,000 more experienced symptoms and sought medical treatment in the days that followed. The Tokyo subway attack remains the most lethal terrorist attack carried out on Japanese soil in the post-war era. Police raids on Aum facilities began immediately. What they found inside the organization's compounds exceeded almost every expectation. Investigators discovered laboratories capable of producing sarin on an industrial scale, along with stockpiles of chemicals sufficient to kill, by official estimates, over 1 million people. They found biological research facilities where the group had been attempting, unsuccessfully, to cultivate anthrax and botulinum toxin as weapons. They found drone aircraft modified to disperse chemical agents. They found that Aum had attempted to acquire a nuclear weapon. Members of the group had traveled to a property in Western Australia where they had tested sarin on sheep, killing 29 animals before deploying it against humans in Japan. Asahara was not found in the initial raids. He was discovered on May 16, 1995, almost 2 months after the subway attack, hiding inside a sealed compartment within a wall at the group's Mount Fuji headquarters. He was sitting in the dark, in a small space between 2 walls, surrounded by cash. He said nothing when they opened the wall and found him. He was arrested without resistance. His trial began in April 1996 and lasted nearly 8 years. It was one of the longest and most complex criminal proceedings in Japanese legal history. Prosecutors read the names of more than 3,000 victims into the court record at the opening of proceedings. Asahara was represented by a team of defense lawyers, but for significant portions of the trial appeared disengaged, sometimes sleeping, sometimes muttering incoherently. Whether this represented genuine mental deterioration, deliberate performance, or some combination of both was debated throughout. On February 27, 2004, the Tokyo District Court found Asahara guilty on 13 counts of murder and sentenced him to death. His appeals were rejected. The final appeal failed in 2011. Execution was delayed for years because trials of other senior OM members were still ongoing, and authorities wanted to preserve the possibility of Asahara providing further testimony. When the last of those trials concluded in January 2018, the delay no longer had any legal justification. On July 6, 2018, Shoko Asahara was taken to the execution chamber at the Tokyo Detention House and hanged. He was 63 years old. 6 other senior OM members were executed the same day. The remaining 6 members on death row were executed on July 26, 2018. All 13 people who had been sentenced to death for the crimes of Om Shinrikyo were executed within a 3-week period. Asahara's ashes became a legal dispute. His youngest daughter, following his stated wishes, initially sought to collect them. The Tokyo Family Court eventually ruled that a different daughter, who had maintained the closest relationship with him during his imprisonment, had the right to the remains. The ashes were kept at the detention center for an extended period over concerns that releasing them could lead to their being venerated by remaining followers. Om Shinrikyo formally changed its name to Aleph in 2000. The organization still exists. As of the years following the executions, Japanese authorities estimated the group had several hundred active members and continued to operate under government surveillance. The Public Security Intelligence Agency has maintained continuous monitoring of the organization. Members have been required to register their addresses with authorities. The Matsumoto attack site has a memorial. The families of the Tokyo subway victims have campaigned for better recognition of what happened to the survivors, many of whom continue to experience health consequences from the sarin exposure more than 30 years later. The next case leaves Japan and moves to the American Pacific Northwest, where a man who had never held political office, never commanded an army, and never done anything more threatening than sell orange peels as medicine arrived from India with a fleet of Rolls-Royces and nearly took over an entire county. He did not claim to be Jesus. He claimed to be something rarer than that. And before it was over, his followers had carried out the largest bioterrorist attack in the history of the United States. Section 5. Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. Chandra Mohan Jain was born on December 11, 1931, in the small village of Kuchwada in the Madhya Pradesh region of central India. He was the eldest of 11 children in a Jain merchant family. His grandparents raised him for the first 7 years of his life, and by his own accounts, those early years were unusually free. No strict schooling, no rigid religious instruction, no firm boundaries. He was remembered by teachers and classmates as exceptionally argumentative, someone who questioned everything and accepted nothing on the basis of authority alone. At 21, while studying at Hitkarini College in Jabalpur, he claimed to have experienced a sudden and complete spiritual awakening, enlightenment in the classical Indian sense, a total dissolution of the ego, and a direct experience of the nature of reality. From this point forward, he organized his entire public identity around it. He completed his studies, earned a degree in philosophy, and joined the faculty of the University of Jabalpur as a lecturer. He gave public lectures across India that drew large audiences. He attacked organized religion. He attacked Gandhi. He argued that sexuality was a legitimate path toward higher consciousness. These positions made him controversial and famous in roughly equal measure. In 1966, he resigned his university post and committed to teaching full-time. By 1970, he had settled in Mumbai and was initiating followers into what he called neo-sannyas. His sannyasins wore orange or red clothing, took Sanskrit names, wore a mala necklace with a locket containing his photograph, and committed to a path of meditation and self-exploration. They were told to embrace life fully, including its pleasures, while working toward inner transformation. In 1971, he adopted the title Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, the Blessed One, the Divine One, a term indicating a human being in whom the divine has become fully manifest. By taking this title, he was stating directly that he was an enlightened master at the highest possible level. By 1974, he had moved to Pune, where his organization established an ashram that became an international destination. Thousands of Westerners traveled there throughout the 1970s, educated professionals, therapists, academics, artists. The ashram offered Rajneesh's lectures, various forms of meditation including his signature dynamic meditation, and therapeutic workshops incorporating techniques from Western psychology alongside Eastern spiritual practice. It was unlike anything else available at the time. Rajneesh gave daily lectures for years, speaking on Zen Buddhism, Sufism, Taoism, Christianity, Tantra, and Western thinkers including Nietzsche and Freud. He was widely read and genuinely intellectually capable. The talks were recorded, transcribed, and published. Eventually, over 600 books attributed to him. The money generated by the ashram was substantial. Rajneesh developed an appetite for luxury increasingly difficult to reconcile with his spiritual framework. He collected watches. He collected Rolls-Royces. By the time he left India for the United States in 1981, the collection had become notorious. The move to America was managed entirely by his personal secretary, Ma Anand Sheela, born Sheila Silverman. She combined organizational ability with an absolute willingness to do whatever she believed was necessary to protect Rajneesh and expand the organization's power. Rajneesh provided the spiritual authority. Sheela provided everything else. In June 1981, the organization purchased a 64,229-acre ranch in Wasco County in the high desert of north-central Oregon. Within months, hundreds of followers had moved there and begun building what would become an incorporated city called Rajneeshpuram. At its peak, the permanent population was around 2,500 people. The commune had its own airstrip, water treatment facility, fire department, bus fleet, post office, shopping mall, hotel, restaurant, medical clinic, and a peace force that functioned as its police. During the annual World Celebration Festival, the population swelled to over 15,000. Rajneesh entered an extended period of public silence from 1981 to 1984. He did not lecture, did not grant interviews. All communication was mediated through Sheela. This gave her extraordinary power, because she was the only conduit to the man his followers regarded as a living god. The relationship between Rajneeshpuram and the surrounding Oregon communities deteriorated quickly. Sheela and the commune's leadership had identified that controlling Wasco County government would allow them to operate with minimal outside interference. In 1982, commune members registered to vote in Antelope, a tiny town near the ranch with a population of around 40 people. They achieved a majority on the Antelope City Council, renamed the town Rajneesh, and installed their own people in local government positions. The original residents were effectively displaced from control of their own community. The next target was Wasco County itself. To win county elections, the commune needed either to increase its own voting numbers or reduce the voting population that opposed them. They attempted both simultaneously. For the first strategy, Sheela organized what was called the Share a Home program, busing thousands of homeless people from cities across the United States. The plan was to register them as voters in Wasco County in time for the November 1984 elections. Around 2,000 homeless people were brought to the commune at its peak. The plan ultimately failed when Oregon election officials ruled the registrations were not valid. For the second strategy, Sheila turned to biology. Inside Rajneeshpuram, the organization had established a medical facility with clinical equipment and laboratory resources. In the summer of 1984, a senior commune member obtained a sample of Salmonella typhimurium from a commercial scientific supply company in Seattle. She cultured it in the commune's laboratory, growing it in quantity. No special equipment was required. The bacteria were not difficult to obtain or grow. Between September 9th and September 17th, 1984, commune members visited 10 restaurants in the Dalles. They carried the Salmonella culture in concealed containers and contaminated the salad bars by pouring or spraying the bacteria onto the food. Within days, people who had eaten at the restaurants began falling severely ill. Severe diarrhea, vomiting, fever, cramping. In total, 751 people were laboratory confirmed as infected. 45 were hospitalized. No one died, but some of those most severely affected required intensive medical care. Local and state health authorities investigated and concluded the outbreak was natural, caused by poor food handling. It was an understandable conclusion given that deliberate biological contamination of a civilian population had never happened in the United States before. There was no framework for thinking about it as a possibility. The true cause was not discovered until a year later, when the commune collapsed from within. In September 1985, Rajneesh broke his years of public silence and called a press conference. He announced that Sheila and her close associates had committed crimes without his knowledge and urged the government to investigate. He said she had bugged his bedroom, attempted to murder his personal physician, and engaged in financial fraud. Sheila and several of her lieutenants had already fled to Europe. They were arrested in West Germany on October 28, 1985, and extradited to the United States. When investigators went through the commune's records and facilities, they found the Salmonella laboratory, the fermentation equipment, and a vial of Salmonella typhimurium, identical to the strain that had infected the Dalles. They found evidence of attempts to cultivate other pathogens, including HIV. They found surveillance equipment used to wiretap commune buildings, including Rajneesh's own quarters. They found evidence of a plot to assassinate the United States Attorney for Oregon, who was leading the federal investigation into the commune. Sheila pleaded guilty to charges including attempted murder, first-degree assault, product tampering, and wiretapping. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She served 29 months and was released in 1988, then deported to Europe. Rajneesh's own legal exposure centered on immigration fraud. Federal investigators documented that the commune had arranged over 400 sham marriages between American citizens and foreign commune members to obtain immigration documents. Rajneesh himself had entered the United States on a visitor's visa in 1981, while intending to establish a permanent residence, a violation of the terms of his entry. On October 27, 1985, Rajneesh boarded a private aircraft at the Rajneeshpuram airstrip. Federal agents were waiting when it landed. He was arrested on 35 counts of immigration fraud, pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of making false statements to immigration officials, was fined $400,000, given a 10-year suspended sentence, and deported from the United States. 21 countries refused him entry in the months that followed. He returned to India in 1986 and reopened his original ashram in Pune. In 1988, he dropped the name Bhagwan, and the following year took the name Osho. On January 19, 1990, Osho died at the Pune ashram. He was 58 years old. The official cause was heart failure. Some followers alleged he had been deliberately poisoned during his time in American detention. These claims were never substantiated. An independent medical examination found no evidence of poisoning. He left behind an organization that continues to operate today under the name Osho International. The Pune ashram is still active and receives thousands of visitors annually. His books remain in print and in wide circulation. The Netflix documentary series Wild Wild Country, released in 2018, introduced the story of Rajneeshpuram to a new generation and generated significant debate about how to assess both the man and what happened in Oregon. The bioterror attack on the Dalles was formally classified as the first and largest bioterrorist attack in United States history, a designation it held until the 2001 anthrax letter attacks. Sheila, now living in Switzerland, has given multiple interviews over the years in which she has been alternately defiant and reflective. She has never fully acknowledged Rajneesh's personal involvement in the crimes of the commune. He was never prosecuted for anything beyond immigration fraud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from Oregon to South Korea, and then to the halls of the United States Congress, where a man who also claimed to be the Messiah built not a commune in a desert, but a global empire worth billions of dollars, arranged the marriages of tens of thousands of strangers, and somehow got a sitting member of the United States Congress to place a crown on his head in a Senate office building while calling him the savior of humanity. Section 6. Sun Myung Moon. Sun Myung Moon was born on January 6, 1920, in the town of Kwonju in what is now North Korea. His family were farmers. He was the fifth of 8 children. When he was 10 years old, his family converted to Christianity and joined a Presbyterian congregation, placing the Bible at the center of his childhood and giving him a framework for thinking about human history as a story with a divine purpose and a coming resolution. By his own account, everything changed on Easter Sunday, 1935, when Moon was 15. He was praying alone on a Korean hillside when Jesus Christ appeared before him. In this vision, Jesus told Moon that he had a mission to complete the work Jesus himself had been unable to finish because of his crucifixion, to establish a perfect family and restore humanity to a state of sinless purity. Moon was being chosen to do it in his place. Moon told almost no one about this experience for years. He studied electrical engineering in Japan during the period of Japanese colonial rule, then returned to Korea after World War II and began preaching. His preaching attracted followers, but also attracted the attention of communist authorities, who arrested him in 1946. He was held, reportedly tortured, released, rearrested, and in 1948 sentenced to 5 years of hard labor at Humnam prison camp, where prisoners worked in a nitrogen fertilizer factory under conditions that killed many inmates. Moon survived. In October 1950, United Nations forces advancing into North Korea liberated the camp. Moon walked south, made it to Pusan, and began gathering followers almost immediately. In 1954, Moon formally established the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity in Seoul. This was the organization that would become known worldwide as the Unification Church, its members known, not affectionately, as Moonies. The foundational text was The Divine Principle, published in 1957, which laid out Moon's interpretation of the Bible and his claims about his own role in human history. The Divine Principle argued that God's original plan had been derailed by the fall in Eden. Jesus had come to restore that plan, but was crucified before completing his mission, which required him to marry and establish a perfect, sinless family. The Lord of the Second Advent would complete what Jesus could not. Moon did not state explicitly in the divine principle that he was this figure, but the implication was clear enough that followers understood it. The church grew first in South Korea and Japan, demanding total commitment from members. Young recruits were expected to fundraise by selling flowers and candles on the street for long hours, recruit new members aggressively, and cut ties with skeptical family members. The accusations of brainwashing that followed the church for decades were rooted in these methods, designed to create psychological dependency on the group and its leadership. Moon moved to the United States in 1971 and immediately built the church's American presence with extraordinary organizational energy. He held large rallies, Madison Square Garden in 1974, Washington Monument in 1976. He cultivated relationships with conservative politicians and positioned the church as a passionate opponent of communism, making it attractive to figures on the American right during the Cold War. The church's business activities expanded in parallel with its religious operations. Moon founded or acquired a remarkable range of enterprises. In 1982, he established the Washington Times in Washington, D.C., which became an influential voice in American conservative media and operated for decades with church subsidies. He also owned United Press International, the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan, a fishing and seafood distribution company that at one point controlled a significant portion of the American sushi supply chain, a tea company, a titanium manufacturing business, and through his South Korean conglomerate Tongil Group, an arms manufacturer that produced weapons for the South Korean military. In 1982, Moon was indicted in the United States on charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to obstruct justice, centered on a Japanese bank account he had failed to report. Moon argued the account belonged to the church, not him personally, and that the prosecution was motivated by religious discrimination. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. He served 13 months at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, and was released in August 1985. The conviction did not slow the organization's growth. Moon framed it as persecution, directly comparable to Jesus' crucifixion, and his followers accepted this framing. The element of Moon's operation that attracted the most sustained public attention was the mass wedding ceremonies. Moon conducted these on a scale that grew over time to almost incomprehensible proportions. The first was in 1961, with 36 couples. By 1982, a ceremony at Madison Square Garden joined 2,075 couples simultaneously. In 1992, he matched 30,000 couples at the Olympic Stadium in Seoul. In 1995, a satellite-linked ceremony joined 360,000 couples across multiple countries at once. These were not conventional weddings. Moon, or his representatives, selected the matches. Couples were often introduced only days or weeks before the ceremony, sometimes having never met in person. Members trusted that Moon, operating with divine insight, had identified their ideal partner in a way human judgment could not. For members who wanted to leave the church, the matched marriage created a profound additional barrier. Leaving meant potentially abandoning a spouse whose entire social world was the church, and children being raised within it. In 1992, Moon made his messianic claim explicit for the first time in a fully public setting. He declared that he was the Lord of the Second Advent, the Messiah, and the Savior of humanity. His wife, Hak Ja Han, was simultaneously declared the true mother. Together, they were the true parents of all humanity. A literal theological claim, not a metaphor. All human beings were their spiritual children. All marriages required their blessing to be spiritually valid. The The 2004 event in a Senate office building on Capitol Hill stands as one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of American political life. A reception was held in the Dirksen Senate office building. More than a dozen members of Congress attended, apparently believing it was a routine awards ceremony. Moon stood at the podium and declared himself the Messiah and Savior of the United States and the entire world. He claimed to have spoken with Hitler and Stalin in the spirit world, and that both had repented and accepted his teachings. At the conclusion, a congressman placed a crown on Moon's head. When the footage became public, several attending members of Congress said they had not understood what they were participating in. Moon's political relationships were extensive and cut across party lines. Former President George H.W. Bush gave paid speeches at church-affiliated events. Mikhail Gorbachev met with Moon. North Korean founder Kim Il-sung hosted Moon in Pyongyang in 1991. After Kim Il-sung died in 1994, Kim Jong-il sent gifts to Moon on his birthday every year. Moon was posthumously awarded North Korea's National Reunification Prize in 2012. One of very few people for whom this recognition would have been considered a genuine honor by his supporters. Moon died on September 3, 2012, at a church-owned hospital in Gapyeong, northeast of Seoul, from complications from pneumonia, including kidney failure. He was 92 years old. His body lay in state for 13 days. His funeral was held on September 15, 2012. What he left behind was considerably more complicated than a church. His widow, Hak Ja-han, assumed leadership of the organization, which had been renamed the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. Almost immediately, the family fractured. His son, Hyungjin Moon, broke with his mother, declared her a heretic, and founded a splinter organization called the World Peace and Unification Sanctuary Church in Pennsylvania, commonly known as the Rod of Iron Ministries, where members are encouraged to bring AR-15 rifles to services, which are blessed during worship. Another of Moon's sons died by jumping from a balcony at a casino in Las Vegas. A third son was accused by his wife of cocaine addiction and domestic abuse before his death. The empire Moon had spent 6 decades building began fighting itself almost before he was buried. The Unification Church's presence in Japan became the subject of a major political crisis following the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in July 2022. The man who shot Abe stated that his motivation was anger at the Unification Church, which he blamed for financially devastating his family through large donations. The assassination reignited scrutiny of the church's fundraising practices in Japan, where it had been accused for decades of pressuring members into ruinous financial contributions. Moon's tax conviction was the one moment when the full machinery of American law reached him directly and produced a consequence. He went to prison for not reporting a bank account. He came out and kept building. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes everything that has come before and strips it to its most elemental form. No international empire, no fleet of Rolls-Royces, no mass weddings in stadiums. Just a small-time criminal who spent half his life in prison, walked out in 1967, gathered a handful of runaways in San Francisco, told them he was both Jesus Christ and the devil simultaneously, and within 2 years had directed the murders of 9 people across 2 nights in Los Angeles. Section 7. Charles Manson. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother was Kathleen Maddox, a 16-year-old girl frequently in trouble with the law. His father was never identified with certainty. His mother was convicted of armed robbery when Charles was around 4 years old and sent to prison. He was passed between relatives and a boys' school while she served her sentence. When she was released, she took him back but was unable to provide stable care. By the time Charles was 9, he was largely fending for himself. He began stealing to survive. At 12, he was sent to the Gibault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. He ran away. He was caught, placed in other institutions, ran away again. By 13, he had committed armed robbery. The pattern that defined the next 2 decades of his life was set by the time he was a teenager. Released from an institution, crimes committed within a short period, returned to custody. He was in and out of juvenile facilities, then federal prisons, for offenses including car theft, check fraud, pimping, and violations of the Mann Act. By the time he was 32, he had spent more than half of his entire life behind bars. During those years in prison, Manson taught himself to play guitar. He studied Scientology materials available in prison and incorporated elements of its language into his own thinking. He read the Bible extensively. He read Dale Carnegie. He studied hypnosis techniques. He was, by multiple accounts from prison staff and fellow inmates, extraordinarily skilled at reading people, identifying their vulnerabilities, and positioning himself as the answer to whatever they were lacking. On March 21, 1967, Manson was released from Terminal Island Federal Prison in California. He was 32 years old and had spent so much of his life institutionalized that he asked prison authorities if he could stay. The request was denied. He was given $35 and a bus ticket and released into San Francisco during the Summer of Love. San Francisco in 1967 was a specific and unrepeatable moment. Tens of thousands of young people had flooded into Haight-Ashbury from across the country, drawn by promises of communal living, spiritual exploration, and a wholesale rejection of mainstream American life. Many were runaways or dropouts. Many were young women who had left difficult home situations and were looking for something to replace the family structures they had abandoned. They were, without intending to be, a population ideally suited to what Manson had spent years in prison preparing to offer. He moved into Haight-Ashbury and began gathering followers within weeks. He played guitar, talked, shared drugs, offered belonging and purpose. He was not physically imposing, around 5 feet 2 inches tall, but he had an intensity that people found magnetic. Women were drawn to him in particular. He provided housing, food, and community. In exchange, he expected total loyalty and total submission to his authority. The group that coalesced around Manson called themselves the Family. At its peak, it had somewhere between 50 and 100 members, the majority of them young women. They lived communally, first in Haight-Ashbury, then on a property called Spahn Ranch in the Santa Susana Mountains northwest of Los Angeles, a former movie set for Western productions whose 80-year-old, nearly blind owner allowed them to stay in exchange for help around the property. Manson's theological claims evolved as the group developed. He told his followers they were the original Christians, reincarnated. He positioned himself as Jesus Christ returned, the one person who could see through the corruption of the existing world order and lead his people through what was coming. What was coming, in Manson's telling, was a race war. He called it Helter Skelter, taking the name from a song on the Beatles' White Album, which he became obsessed with in late 1968. He interpreted the album as a prophecy of an apocalyptic conflict between black and white Americans, in which black Americans would rise up and overthrow the white establishment. Manson told his followers that the family would survive this war by hiding in a secret underground city beneath Death Valley. After the war, the victors would prove unable to govern and would turn to Manson to lead them. By the summer of 1969, Manson had become increasingly frustrated that his music career was going nowhere. He had developed a connection with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had allowed Manson and the family to live in his Los Angeles home for several months in 1968 at an estimated cost of $100,000. Through Wilson, Manson had met record producer Terry Melcher, who had shown some interest in Manson's music but ultimately declined to sign him. When Melcher moved out of his rented home on Cielo Drive in Bel Air, film director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, moved in. On the evening of August 8, 1969, Manson summoned 4 followers: Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, and told Watson to take the 3 women to the house on Cielo Drive and kill everyone inside. He wanted it done as gruesomely as possible. He told them he wanted to leave a sign. Sharon Tate was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant. She was at the house with 4 friends: hairstylist Jay Sebring, heiress Abigail Folger, screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting the property's caretaker. Roman Polanski was in Europe. Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel entered the property after midnight, while Kasabian remained outside. Parent was shot 4 times in his car as he was leaving. The 4 people inside the house were attacked. Jay Sebring was shot and stabbed 7 times. Abigail Folger was stabbed 28 times. Wojciech Frykowski was shot twice, struck over the head 13 times, and stabbed 51 times. Sharon Tate pleaded for her life and for the life of her unborn child. She was stabbed 16 times. The word "pig" was written on the front door in her blood. Manson was not satisfied. The following night, he went with a larger group to a house on Waverly Drive belonging to supermarket chain owner Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. Manson entered the house and bound the LaBiancas himself before leaving and sending Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten inside. Lino LaBianca was stabbed 26 times. A carving fork was left embedded in his stomach. The word "war" was carved into his abdomen. Rosemary LaBianca was stabbed 41 times. Helter Skelter, misspelled, was written on the refrigerator door in blood. The Tate and LaBianca murders were initially treated as separate cases. The connection to Manson and his followers was not established until later in the year, largely through the confession of Susan Atkins to a fellow inmate while in custody on an unrelated charge. Atkins told her cellmate what had happened at Cielo Drive. The cellmate told authorities. On October 12, 1969, police raided Spahn Ranch on suspicion of auto theft. Manson and over 24 family members were arrested. Manson was not yet connected to the murders and was released. It was only in late November that formal murder charges were filed. The trial began on June 15, 1970, and became one of the most chaotic criminal proceedings in American history. Manson showed up on the first day with an X carved into his forehead. The women on trial with him carved matching X's into their own foreheads. During proceedings, Manson leaped across the defense table, attempting to attack the judge, and was physically restrained and removed. Female family members who were not on trial held a vigil outside the courthouse for months, shaving their heads when Manson did and singing his songs. On January 25, 1971, the verdicts came in. Manson was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the deaths of 7 people. He was sentenced to death. Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten received the same sentence. In February 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty unconstitutional. All death sentences were automatically commuted to life imprisonment. Manson was transferred to various California state prisons over the following decades. Prison did not diminish his notoriety. It amplified it. Manson became one of the most written-about criminals in American history. His face appeared on T-shirts and posters. Bands named themselves after him or recorded his songs. Documentaries, books, films, and academic papers accumulated around him in a volume that few historical figures of any kind could match. He gave interviews from prison that were watched by millions. He applied for parole 12 times and was denied every time. In 1984, a fellow inmate poured paint thinner over Manson while he was reading in his cell and set him on fire. Manson suffered second- and third-degree burns over roughly 20% of his body. He survived. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died at Kern County Hospital in Bakersfield, California. He was 83 years old. The cause of death was respiratory and circulatory failure as a result of colon cancer. He had been in continuous custody for 46 years. He never expressed remorse. In his last public interview, asked if he felt bad about what had happened, he said he had done nothing wrong. He said he had never told anyone to do anything wrong. Catherine Scher, one of the family members who had believed most completely in his messianic claims, later became a victim's advocate for people affected by cults. Bruce Davis, described by prosecutors as Manson's right-hand man, became a prison minister at San Quentin. He remains incarcerated. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from California to Florida, where a man who named himself God, the Son of God, built a real estate empire in Liberty City, got the mayor of Miami to declare a day in his honor, and was running a secret team of enforcers who were cutting off their victims' ears and bringing them to him as trophies of murder, all while the city's power structure was shaking his hand and calling him a community hero. Section 8. Yahweh Ben Yahweh. Hulan Mitchell Jr. was born on October 27, 1935, in Kingfisher, Oklahoma. He was the oldest of 15 children. His father was a Pentecostal minister. Growing up in a deeply religious household in rural Oklahoma during the 1930s and 1940s meant a childhood shaped by scripture, church authority, and the particular weight that comes from being the firstborn son of a man who preached the Word of God for a living. Mitchell absorbed all of it and eventually turned it into something his father could never have imagined. He was academically capable and left Oklahoma for higher education. He attended college and later studied law. He joined the United States military. By his late 20s, he had found his way into the Nation of Islam, the black nationalist religious organization led by Elijah Muhammad, and took the name Hulan X, following the NOI practice of replacing the surname with X to represent the African name lost through slavery. He was, by accounts from people who knew him during this period, charismatic and effective as a speaker. He left the Nation of Islam in the late 1960s. The reasons were never fully documented publicly, but the departure marked the beginning of a period in which he cycled through different religious identities and different names. In various cities, he called himself Brother Love, Father Michel, and Shah. In each place, he gathered a small following, taught, preached, and moved on. He was building something, refining it, testing what worked on an audience before committing to a final form. In 1978, Mitchell arrived in Miami, Florida. He was 42 years old. Miami in the late 1970s was a city under extraordinary pressure. Liberty City, a predominantly black neighborhood in the northwest of the city, was one of the poorest and most violent urban areas in the United States. Unemployment was severe. Drug trafficking was reshaping the streets. In May 1980, Liberty City erupted in some of the worst race riots in American history, following the acquittal of 4 white police officers who had beaten a black insurance salesman named Arthur McDuffie to death. 18 people were killed in those riots. The neighborhood was raw and desperate for something that looked like salvation. Mitchell gave it one. He had by this point constructed his final theological identity. He changed his name to Yahweh Ben Yahweh. In Hebrew, the phrase means God, Son of God. It was not a subtle claim. He taught that the biblical God and all the prophets of the Bible were black. He taught that the true Israelites of the Scripture were black Americans, whose identity and heritage had been stolen from them through slavery. He taught that white people were, by their nature, devils who had temporarily usurped power over the rightful inheritors of the earth. And he taught that he, Yahweh ben Yahweh, was the black Messiah, the one sent to restore what had been taken. He established his headquarters in a building in Liberty City that he called the Temple of Love. It was a concrete structure, bunker-like in its architecture, which suited the fortress mentality that would eventually define the organization. Around it, Mitchell built a community. His followers, who were required to take Hebrew names and wear white robes and head coverings, lived collectively. They ran businesses. They cleaned up properties. They established order in a neighborhood where order had largely collapsed. From the outside, and for several years from the inside of Miami's civic life, what Mitchell had built looked like exactly what Liberty City needed. The Nation of Yahweh, as the organization was formally called, took abandoned and deteriorating properties and renovated them. They established businesses, including a bakery, a restaurant, a moving company, and various retail operations. They created employment for members. They imposed strict codes of behavior within the community they controlled. No alcohol, no drugs, no crime. Members who followed the rules had structure, purpose, income, and a sense of belonging in a neighborhood where all of those things had been scarce. The organization expanded rapidly. By the mid-1980s, the Nation of Yahweh had established temples in 22 states and claimed membership in the tens of thousands. Mitchell himself was becoming a recognized figure in Miami's civic life. Politicians sought his endorsement. Business leaders cultivated his relationship. He was photographed with mayors, commissioners, and law enforcement officials who praised his work in Liberty City. His organization received contracts for renovation work on city properties. Local media ran positive stories about the community he had built. The gap between that public face and what was actually happening inside the Temple of Love was enormous, and it was growing wider with every passing year. Behind the public image of community uplift, Mitchell had constructed a system of total control over his followers that relied on fear, isolation, and violence. Members surrendered their finances to the organization. They lived where the organization told them to live and worked where it told them to work. They ate communally and were expected to donate the vast majority of any income they earned outside the commune to the temple. Contact with family members outside the organization was discouraged and, in many cases, severed entirely. Mitchell demanded absolute deference from his followers in all things. He presented himself not merely as a religious teacher, but as a divine being whose instructions carried the same authority as the Word of God. To question him was not merely insubordinate, it was spiritually catastrophic. This framework ensured that the people most committed to the organization, those who had given up the most to be there, were also the least psychologically equipped to challenge anything they witnessed. The violence began early. In 1981, a member of the Nation of Yahweh named Aston Green decided to leave the organization. He was found shortly afterward in the Florida Everglades. He had been beaten severely. His head had been cut from his body and placed beside it. His two roommates, Carlton Carey and Mildred Banks, went to the police to report what they had seen in connection with Green's death. When they returned home, gunmen were waiting for them. Carlton Carey was shot and killed outside the front door. Mildred Banks was shot, struck with a machete, and left for dead. She survived. This was 1981. The Nation of Yahweh was still in its early years. Aston Green's murder was investigated but never conclusively solved by police at the time. The investigation did not reach the organization's leadership. Mitchell continued building. Inside the organization, a secret group had been formed. Mitchell called them the Brotherhood. Outsiders and prosecutors would later call them the Death Angels. Membership in the Brotherhood required a demonstration of absolute loyalty and absolute willingness to act on Mitchell's instructions, regardless of what those instructions were. The specific initiation requirement, as documented in court testimony, was murder. A prospective death angel was required to kill a white person, cut off one of their ears, and bring the ear to Mitchell as proof of the kill. This was not rumor or allegation. It was documented in federal court proceedings through the testimony of multiple witnesses, including Robert Rozier, a former professional football player who had played for the St. Louis Cardinals and the Oakland Raiders before joining the Nation of Yahweh. Rozier went by the name Neriah Israel within the organization. He was a death angel. He testified that he personally committed multiple murders at Mitchell's direction, and that he and other Brotherhood members brought severed ears to Mitchell to demonstrate their kills. In 1986, the violence escalated significantly. The Nation of Yahweh had purchased a rundown apartment complex in Opa-locka, a city adjacent to Miami. Residents of the complex who were not members of the organization were told to leave. Two residents, Anthony Brown and Rudolph Broussard, refused and spoke publicly about being forced out. That same evening, they were shot and killed outside the building. Also in 1986, a series of murders took place across Miami-Dade County in which victims, all of them white, were killed and had their ears removed. 9 people were murdered in this series of attacks. The killings were carried out by death angels operating on Mitchell's instructions. In October 1986, Sheila Barge and Claire Walters were 2 white people attacked in Broward County. Both were killed. Rozier later testified to his involvement in these murders as part of his cooperation agreement with prosecutors. The organization simultaneously carried out a firebombing attack on a neighborhood in Delray Beach, Florida. The attack damaged homes and was intended to intimidate people who had resisted the organization's expansion into that area. Throughout this period, Miami's public life remained largely unaware of the organization's criminal dimensions. The civic honors continued to accumulate. In October 1990, the mayor of Miami, Xavier Suarez, declared October 7th Yahweh Ben Yahweh Day in the city of Miami. The declaration praised Mitchell's contributions to community development and economic empowerment in Liberty City. It was signed and ceremonially delivered. 28 days later, on November 7, 1990, federal agents arrested Yahweh Ben Yahweh and 15 of his followers on charges of racketeering, extortion, arson, and murder. The arrest came after a years-long investigation by the FBI and local law enforcement that had slowly assembled the evidence connecting the Nation of Yahweh's leadership to the murders and other crimes. The indictment charged 18 specific instances of racketeering, including 14 killings, 2 attempted killings, extortion, and arson. Federal prosecutors publicly described Mitchell as the most notorious criminal in South Florida. The trial lasted 5 months. It was one of the most complex federal prosecutions in Florida history. Rozier was the star witness for the prosecution. He had already pleaded guilty separately to 4 murders and agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a 22-year sentence. His testimony was detailed and damning. He described the Brotherhood's structure, the initiation requirements, the specific murders he had participated in, and the role Mitchell played as the authority from whom all instructions ultimately came. Mitchell appeared in court in white robes and a turban, quoting the Bible throughout the proceedings. His sister testified on his behalf. His nephew testified on his behalf. Police officers who had dealt with the organization's community work testified in his defense. His lawyer, Jane Weintraub, mounted an aggressive defense that challenged Rozier's credibility and argued that Mitchell could not be held responsible for the independent actions of his followers. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict on May 27, 1992. Mitchell and 6 other members of the Nation of Yahweh were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The conspiracy conviction covered his role in directing and facilitating the murders, even if he had not personally carried them out. He was acquitted of more serious racketeering charges that would have tied him more directly to the specific killings. On June 30, 1992, Mitchell was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and fined $20,000. He was also indicted separately on state first-degree murder charges. Those charges went to trial in 1992, and he was acquitted. Mitchell served his federal sentence at various Bureau of Prisons facilities. He was assigned federal inmate number 22031-034. During his imprisonment, his followers remained largely devoted to him. The organization contracted significantly after his arrest and conviction. Many members left. Properties were foreclosed. The Temple of Love in Liberty City was lost. But a core of believers maintained their faith in him and in his teachings. On September 26, 2001, Mitchell was released on parole. He had served 11 years of his 18-year sentence. The terms of his parole were strict. He was prohibited from having any contact with past or present members of the Nation of Yahweh. He was barred from any form of communication, including internet, telephone, radio, or television that could reach organization members. He lived alone in Miami, separated from the community he had built and the followers who still revered him. In 2006, Mitchell was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The disease progressed. His lawyers petitioned the federal court to terminate his parole supervision on the grounds that he was terminally ill. The petition was granted. On May 7, 2007, Hulon Mitchell Jr., known to his followers as Yahweh ben Yahweh, the Black Messiah, God, the Son of God, died in his sleep at his home in Opa-locka, Florida. He was 71 years old. Prostate cancer was the cause. His funeral was held 6 days later in Pembroke Pines, Florida. Nearly 500 followers attended, dressed in white. They drove white Lincoln and Lexus luxury cars. They mourned the man they still believed was a divine being. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which had monitored the Nation of Yahweh for years, noted that the organization showed strong signs of continuing activity even after his death, with followers interpreting his trial and death as a direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy about the persecution of the Messiah. Robert Rozier, whose testimony had been central to Mitchell's conviction, fared badly after his cooperation agreement. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, but was later convicted in California under that state's 3 strikes law following a check fraud conviction. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. The murders connected to the Nation of Yahweh across the organization's criminal period totaled at least 14 confirmed killings that formed part of the federal indictment, with investigators believing the true number to be as high as 23. The ears brought to Mitchell as initiation trophies were never recovered. The next case leaves Florida entirely and travels to the forests of Siberia, where a former traffic police officer who lost his job in 1989 walked out of his uniform, grew his hair long, put on a white robe, and told several thousand Russians that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. They believed him completely, and for nearly 30 years, Russian authorities largely left him alone to run his forest kingdom however he chose. Section 9. Vissarion Sergei Anatolyevich Torop was born on January 14, 1961, in Krasnodar, a city in southern Russia near the Black Sea. His parents were ordinary Soviet citizens. His father was named Anatoly Torop. His mother was named Nadezhda. There was nothing in his early life that distinguished him from millions of other Soviet-born men of his generation. He did his mandatory military service, serving as a sergeant working on construction projects in Mongolia. After the military, he worked as a factory metal worker in Minusинsk, a small city in the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia. He was then hired as a traffic police officer in Minusинsk, a job he held for several years. In 1989, he was fired from the police force. The exact reason for his dismissal has never been fully documented in public records. What happened next unfolded against a specific historical backdrop that is essential to understanding why it worked. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The economic system that had structured every aspect of Soviet life for 7 decades was disintegrating. Factories were closing. Savings were becoming worthless. The Communist Party, which had functioned as the ideological foundation of Soviet existence, was losing its authority at a speed that left millions of people with no coherent framework for understanding the world or their place in it. The spiritual and psychological vacuum this created was vast. Torup later said that in 1990, at the age of 29, he experienced what he described as a spiritual awakening. He said he suddenly understood who he was and why he had been born. He was not Sergei Torup, the unemployed former traffic cop. He was Vissarion, meaning he who gives new life. He was the Word of God made flesh. He was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, returned to earth at the precise moment of maximum human need to deliver a final teaching that would allow humanity to survive the coming catastrophe. On August 18, 1991, Torup delivered his first public sermon in Minusинsk. He was 30 years old. The Soviet Union formally dissolved 4 months later, in December 1991. The timing was not coincidental in the minds of those who heard him. A man claiming to be Jesus Christ appeared and began preaching in Siberia at the exact moment that the entire ideological structure of Soviet life collapsed. For people who were frightened, disoriented, and desperate for meaning, the convergence was extraordinary. He founded the Church of the Last Testament in Krasnoyarsk in 1991. He styled himself to match the most familiar depictions of Jesus. He grew his hair long. He grew a beard. He wore white robes. He spoke quietly and with apparent deliberation, allowing spaces between his sentences that his followers experienced as weighted with spiritual significance. He traveled on foot through Siberian villages, gathering people as he went. Former Red Army colonels joined, musicians joined, doctors and teachers joined. A former minister of Belarus joined. People came from Cuba, Bulgaria, Belgium, Australia, and Germany. Torup's theology combined elements of Russian Orthodox Christianity, Buddhism, apocalypticism, and what could broadly be described as ecological mysticism. He taught that the end of the world was approaching and that only his followers would survive it. He taught that his community needed to withdraw from modern civilization and return to a simple, land-based existence in harmony with the natural world. He taught that meat-eating, alcohol, smoking, and swearing were spiritually destructive and must be abandoned entirely. He taught that money was a corrupting force and instructed his followers to stop using it within the community. He replaced Christmas with a feast day celebrated on his own birthday, January 14th. He claimed he could cure cancer and AIDS by laying hands on the sick. In 1994, the Church of the Last Testament was officially registered with the Russian Ministry of Justice as a legitimate religious organization. This gave it legal standing and some degree of protection from interference. Torup began moving his followers to a remote location in the Krasnoyarsk region, deep in the Siberian taiga, in the mountains near Lake Tiber-Kul. The settlement they built there was called the Abode of Dawn, though followers also called it the City of the Sun. It sat at an elevation of around 1,000 meters in terrain that was difficult to reach, particularly in winter, and that required significant physical hardship simply to inhabit. What they built in those mountains over the following years was, by any objective measure, an impressive feat of communal construction. The settlement had its own schools, workshops, galleries, performance spaces, and churches. The churches were topped with a Star of Bethlehem rather than a cross, reflecting Torup's teaching that he had come to supersede the Christianity of the previous 2 millennia with a final, complete revelation. Residents grew their own food, made their own clothing, built their own houses using timber from the surrounding forest. The houses were often elaborately carved and decorated, expressing a folk art aesthetic that journalists who visited the settlement consistently noted as genuinely beautiful. The innermost community at the Abode of Dawn, the roughly 300 people who lived closest to Torup himself on the hilltop, was the most intensely controlled part of the organization. Below it, in the valleys and surrounding settlements of the Krasnoyarsk region, approximately 4,000 more followers lived in about 20 villages. Beyond that, the Church of the Last Testament claimed adherents in Russia and in other countries, with the total number of people who identified with Vissarion's teachings estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 at the organization's peak. Torup himself lived at the top of the hill in the Abode of Dawn, in a residence that was more comfortable than those of his followers. He married a second time after repudiating his first wife. His second wife was a 19-year-old woman who had lived with him since she was a teenager. This detail, documented in court records, received relatively little attention at the time in the context of the broader coverage of the community as an interesting spiritual experiment. The daily routine for followers in the innermost community was structured entirely around Torup's teachings and presence. Morning gatherings in the central square, where men in white clothing stood shoulder to pray and receive the day's assignments, were a regular feature. Torup conducted services. He gave teachings. He was available to his followers in a way that suggested genuine pastoral care. Visitors who came to the settlement in the years before the arrest, including journalists and documentary filmmakers, consistently found people who appeared content, who spoke of Torup with deep devotion, and who described their lives as meaningful in ways that their previous existence in Russian cities had not been. This presentation was consistent and genuinely difficult to read as performance. The people in the settlement were not visibly suffering in the ways that cult members in many other organizations had suffered. They were thin because the diet was sparse and vegetarian. They were isolated because the physical location was remote. But they were not chained. They were not visibly beaten. They were not imprisoned. Visitors who came and went reported encountering people who seemed to have made a genuine choice to be there. What visitors did not see, and what took nearly 3 decades to surface in a legally actionable form, was what was happening beneath the surface of that apparent contentment. Allegations about financial exploitation had circulated around Torup's organization for years. The structure of the community required followers to surrender economic independence entirely. They worked without conventional wages. Any money they brought with them when they joined was absorbed into the communal economy, which Torup and his senior associates controlled. People who left the community, particularly those who had sold homes or liquidated savings to join, found themselves with nothing. The Russian Orthodox Church had called Torup a faker and an antichrist for years. Local authorities had investigated the community periodically. None of these investigations had produced criminal charges before 2020. Torup had also been publicly candid about his claims in a way that most cult leaders were not. In a 2002 interview with The Guardian newspaper, he was asked directly whether he was Jesus Christ. He said, "It is all very complicated, but to keep things simple, yes, I am Jesus Christ." He said this calmly, without apparent discomfort, as if it were a straightforward factual statement about his identity. In a 2012 interview with Vice, he sat with a journalist in his community and spoke about his teachings with the same measured quality. He declined to say what his favorite food was on the grounds that Vissarion did not have preferences in the way ordinary people did. In February 2020, Russian investigators began questioning hundreds of community members in connection with a fraud investigation linked to a school the community operated. Community members reported the interrogations with alarm, but without a clear understanding of what authorities were building toward. The community had experienced scrutiny before and had always survived it. In September 2020, the community was in an unusual situation. The coronavirus pandemic had caused Torup and his senior associates to close the settlements to outside visitors entirely. Membership inquiries had, according to Torup's deputy Vadim Redkin, tripled since the start of the pandemic. People were afraid and looking for something stable. The Abode of Dawn seemed to offer exactly that. On the morning of September 22, 2020, helicopters appeared over the settlement. They were military helicopters, and they carried armed agents of the Federal Security Service of Russia, the FSB, which is the successor organization to the Soviet KGB. The agents descended on the Abode of Dawn in a coordinated operation. They had brought cages, according to one community member who witnessed the raid, in case there was psychological instability among the followers during the arrest. There was none. Torup and two of his senior associates, Vadim Redkin and Vladimir Vadernikov, were led out of buildings by masked commandos, placed in a van, and then transferred to a helicopter. Footage of the arrest was released by the Russian Investigative Committee and shown on Russian state television. It showed Torup, 59 years old, with long gray hair and a beard, being led by men in tactical gear. He appeared calm. He did not resist. He did not speak. He was taken to Novosibirsk, where he was held in custody at a Central District Court facility. The charges against Torup, Redkin, and Vadernikov were running an illegal religious organization, causing physical harm to members, and extortion. Investigators alleged that the three men had used psychological manipulation to control followers and extract money and labor from them over a period of nearly 3 decades, specifically between 1991 and 2020. Prosecutors stated that their actions had caused moral harm to 16 people, serious physical health damage to 6 people, and moderate physical health damage to 1 person. Investigators also reported finding rifles and ammunition caches at the settlement during the raid. These were not acknowledged by community members in their public statements. The arrest generated significant debate in Russia. Human rights advocates questioned whether the prosecution was genuinely about protecting community members or whether it was part of a broader Russian government campaign to suppress nonconformist religious groups that operated outside the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church. Svetlana Ganushkina, a prominent Russian human rights figure, said that ideology can only be beaten with ideology, and that the methods used in the arrest risked turning Torup into a martyr in the eyes of his followers. That concern was well-founded. In the immediate aftermath of the arrest, many community members expressed not alarm at what their leader was accused of, but anger at the Russian government for taking him. They continued to regard him as Jesus Christ. The community did not dissolve. People remained in the settlements. They continued to live by the rules Torup had established. They waited for what would come next. What came next took nearly 5 years. The trial was delayed repeatedly. Torup sat in a detention facility in Novosibirsk for the duration. In October 2021, the New York Times reported that he was still being held with no trial date set. A photograph published by the Daily Mail showed him sitting handcuffed in a cell, not in white robes, but in a gray sweatsuit. He appeared older. The long hair and beard remained. In 2022, the Church of the Last Testament was formally liquidated by court order. The legal existence of the organization was ended by judicial decision. The trial proceeded through its lengthy course. On June 30, 2025, the court in Novosibirsk delivered its verdict. Sergei Torop was found guilty of creating a religious organization that violated the civil rights of its members and caused them bodily harm. He was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison camp. Vladimir Vedernikov received the same sentence. Vadim Redkin received 11 years. All three were convicted. Torop was 64 years old at the time of sentencing. A 12-year sentence means he would be 76 if he serves it in full before release, assuming no reduction for any reason. The settlements in the Krasnoyarsk region continue to exist. Some of his followers remain there. Whether they will continue to regard him as Jesus Christ while he serves his sentence in a Siberian prison camp is a question that has not yet been answered. He told The Guardian in 2002 that, to keep things simple, yes, he was Jesus Christ. He now occupies a prison cell in the same region of Russia where he spent 30 years being worshipped as one. The final case in this series closes the circle in an unexpected place. It is not a story of mass death or bioterrorism or nerve agents on a subway. It is a story of a man who built the most financially successful divine empire of anyone in this entire series, who rubbed shoulders with heads of state and presidents, who got himself crowned Messiah in the United States Senate, and who died peacefully in a hospital bed at 92, surrounded by his family. A reminder that declaring yourself God does not guarantee catastrophe. Sometimes it just makes you extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly, rich. Section 10. David Berg. David Brant Berg was born on February 18, 1919, in Oakland, California. His father was a traveling evangelist named Hjalmar Berg. His mother was Virginia Brant Berg, a radio evangelist who broadcast Christian programming and was well known in American evangelical circles in the 1930s and 1940s. Religion was not a background feature of Berg's childhood. It was the entire foreground. He grew up watching his parents use media, performance, and charisma to move audiences toward belief. He absorbed every technique. Berg attended Westmont College in Santa Barbara, a Christian liberal arts institution. He did not complete his degree. He worked for a period as a teacher in Arizona, then attempted to follow his parents into ministry, working with the Christian and Missionary Alliance denomination in the early 1950s. That relationship ended badly. The denomination dismissed him following allegations of sexual misconduct. The specific details of those allegations were never fully aired publicly, but the pattern they represented would repeat and expand across the following 5 decades until it became one of the most extensively documented cases of institutionalized child sexual abuse in the history of American religious movements. After his dismissal from the Christian and Missionary Alliance, Berg worked for a period with his mother's ministry and later with Teen Challenge, an evangelical outreach organization founded by David Wilkerson. He moved through various ministry contexts throughout the 1950s and early 1960s without finding stable footing. He was in his late 40s with a wife named Jane Miller, known within the movement as Mother Eve, and 4 children when everything changed. In 1968, Berg was helping run a small Christian coffee house in Huntington Beach, California, called the Light Club. It was an outreach to young people, particularly the drifting, drug-using teenagers and young adults who had passed through the summer of love and were now scattered across California without direction. Berg was 49. He found in this specific population the same vulnerability that other figures in this series had identified and exploited. These were young people who had rejected mainstream American life but had not yet found anything stable to replace it with. They were spiritually hungry, socially disconnected, and susceptible to a charismatic older authority figure who offered them family, purpose, and absolute answers. Berg began calling himself Moses David. The Moses was deliberate. He was positioning himself as a prophet leading his people out of captivity, out of the corrupt and dying civilization of mainstream America into a promised land of spiritual truth. The group that gathered around him in Huntington Beach initially called themselves Teens for Christ. They were young, enthusiastic, and completely devoted to Berg. He called them his family. The name stuck. They became the Children of God. The Children of God operated initially as a traveling evangelical group, moving in caravans of vehicles across the American Southwest, setting up camps, preaching, singing, and recruiting. They were visible and energetic and attracted media attention in the early 1970s, some of it positive, much of it suspicious. Parents of members began contacting each other and law enforcement to report that their children had essentially disappeared into the organization, cutting off contact and surrendering everything they owned to Berg and his inner circle. Ted Patrick, a community relations worker who became the most prominent figure in what was then called the deprogramming movement, was hired by multiple families to extract their children from the Children of God. He estimated in the early 1970s that the group had around 10,000 members worldwide. Berg himself was not traveling with the caravans. He had separated himself from the main body of followers and was directing the organization through an extraordinary volume of written documents that he called Mo letters. Mo was short for Moses. These letters were Berg's primary tool for communicating his theology, his instructions, his revelations, and, increasingly, his sexual demands to the membership. They were printed, distributed, and treated with the reverence accorded to Scripture. Members were expected to read them, study them, discuss them, and implement whatever they directed. The Mo letters started as evangelical Christian material in the late 1960s, but shifted in content dramatically as Berg's power over the organization solidified and as his own sexual preoccupations became more explicit. By the early 1970s, the letters were incorporating increasingly sexual content. Berg claimed that God had revealed to him that traditional Christian sexual morality was a form of oppression, and that sexuality freely expressed was spiritually liberating. He taught that love, in all its forms, including physical love, was a reflection of God's nature, and that conventional restrictions on sexual behavior were inventions of a corrupt establishment designed to control and diminish human beings. This theology had a name. Berg called it the Law of Love. In practice, it meant that within the organization, conventional sexual boundaries did not apply. Adults were encouraged to be sexually available to each other in the name of expressing God's love. Sexual exclusivity in marriage was reframed as selfishness, and the boundaries between adults and children, which Berg systematically dismantled through a series of Mo letters that were explicit about his belief that children were sexual beings from birth, were treated as arbitrary restrictions invented by a godless society. Berg communicated directly with his followers through the Mo letters, but lived in secrecy. His physical location was known only to a small inner circle. He moved frequently, living in various countries in Europe and the Middle East throughout the 1970s and 1980s, always with a small household staff, always directing the global organization from a distance. He communicated with his senior leadership by mail and later by other means as technology allowed. The secrecy was presented to members as a spiritual necessity. Their prophet, like Moses before him, had to be set apart. The secrecy also served a more practical function. It made him nearly impossible to investigate or prosecute. In 1976, Berg introduced what became the most notorious practice in the Children of God's history. He called it flirty fishing. The concept was built on a passage in the Gospels where Jesus tells his disciples they will become fishers of men. Berg reinterpreted this literally and sexually. Female members of the organization, and eventually male members as well, were instructed to use their bodies and their sexual availability to attract new members and financial donors to the group. Women in the organization were directed to have sex with men outside the group as an act of ministry, a demonstration of God's love that would draw them toward the children of God and toward salvation. This was documented extensively in the Mo letters themselves, which Berg distributed internally and which eventually became available to investigators and journalists. Berg did not hide what he was instructing. He described it in explicit detail and framed it as divine revelation. He wrote about his own sexual relationship with his secretary, a woman named Karen Zerby, who went by the name Maria within the organization, and who became his common-law wife after he left his first wife. He distributed photographs of himself with Zerby that were explicitly sexual in nature, as part of what he presented as a transparency about the freedom from conventional morality that the law of love produced. The flirty fishing practice continued within the organization until 1987, when it was officially discontinued. The official reason given was the AIDS epidemic. During the approximately 11 years it was in operation, the organization's own publications documented tens of thousands of sexual contacts between members and outsiders. The documents were explicit and detailed. They constituted, among other things, a comprehensive, self-created record of the organization's practices that investigators later used extensively. Berg had made his divine claims explicit by the early 1970s. He taught that God communicated directly with him and through him. He claimed to receive direct prophetic revelation. He taught that his authority was absolute because it derived not from any human institution, but from God himself. He described himself in various Mo letters using messianic language, as a prophet in the tradition of Moses and Elijah, as someone through whom God was speaking to humanity in its final days before the apocalypse. He predicted that the apocalypse would occur in 1993. It did not. The sexual abuse of children within the Children of God was not incidental to the organization's theology. It was produced by it. Berg's writings promoted certain views on development. Some materials distributed within the group contained claims about what was considered natural. Other materials described personal experiences presented as spiritually significant. These documents were circulated among members and used to shape practices within the organization. Children born into the group were raised in an environment where these teachings were treated as authoritative and where certain behaviors by adults were normalized. Many had no external frame of reference and later came to understand their experiences differently. One individual, born in 1975 to a leader within the organization, was raised according to internal guidelines documented in materials distributed to members. Those materials reflected the group's approach to upbringing. Berg and his partner had a son with another individual. Berg considered the boy his own and designated him as his spiritual successor. The boy's upbringing was documented in a publication the group distributed internally as a guide. That publication contained accounts of interactions between the boy and adults in his household during his early years. It was presented as reflecting the group's teachings and was widely circulated. The boy grew up within the organization's leadership circle. As a young adult, he left. He later spent years trying to come to terms with his experiences and sought accountability through legal means with little success. His mother, Karen Zerby, had by this point taken over leadership of the organization after Berg's death and lived in hiding. Berg himself was dead and beyond prosecution. The specific individuals who had abused Ricky as a child were scattered across dozens of countries. On January 8, 2005, Ricky Rodriguez drove to an apartment in Tucson, Arizona, where he met a woman named Angela Smith, who had been one of his childhood nannies and who had been present during some of the abuse documented in the Davidito book. He killed her with a knife. He then drove away, called his wife on the phone, recorded a final video in which he explained what he had done and why, and shot himself. He was 29 years old. His wife, Elixia Munoz, made the video public after his death. In it, Rodriguez speaks with controlled anger about what was done to him and to the other children of the organization. He says he did what he did because there was no other way to make anyone understand. The video was widely circulated and became one of the most significant pieces of testimony about life inside the Children of God ever made public. David Berg died on October 1, 1994, in an undisclosed location. He was 75 years old. The cause of death was given as cardiac arrest. He had spent the last decades of his life in hiding, moving between locations in Europe and elsewhere, directing the organization through Karen Zerby and through the continued distribution of his writings. He was never arrested. He was never charged with any crime. He died in a bed somewhere, his location unknown to law enforcement, having spent approximately 3 decades systematically constructing a religious framework that justified the sexual abuse of children on a global scale. The organization he founded changed its name multiple times. It was the Children of God, then the Family of Love, then the Family, and is currently known as the Family International. It continues to exist. Its membership has contracted dramatically from its peak. The organization has officially repudiated the flirty fishing practice and some of the more extreme positions in Berg's early Mo letters. It has maintained that the abuse of children that occurred was the result of misapplication of Berg's teachings by individual members rather than a product of the theology itself. Former members and investigators who spent years documenting the organization's practices have consistently rejected this characterization. Multiple countries investigated the organization and removed children from its care during the 1980s and 1990s, including Argentina, Australia, Spain, France, and the United Kingdom. Court proceedings in several of these countries resulted in the children being returned to the organization after investigators concluded that while the environment was unusual, they could not meet the legal threshold for removal. Some of the children removed in those raids were later among the adults who testified publicly about what they had experienced. Karen Zerby, known as Maria, continues to lead the Family International. Her current location is not publicly known. She has never been charged with any crime in any jurisdiction. Berg claimed throughout his life that everything he taught came directly from God. He taught his followers that conventional morality was a human invention designed to restrict divine love. He built a global organization on that claim and used it to do things that courts in multiple countries eventually concluded were criminal, even when they could not prosecute the specific individuals responsible. He died before any of it caught up with him legally. 9 of the 10 people in this series ended in prison, execution, fire, or mass death. Berg ended in a bed. The theology was the same across all 10 cases. The claim was the same. The structure of control was the same. The outcomes were different only in their specific shape, not in the direction they all traveled. Every person in this series began with a claim of divine authority and used that claim to take something from the people who believed them, whether it was their money, their bodies, their freedom, their children, or their lives. The pattern does not change. Only the setting does. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.